Please put your computer on mute. It is my great pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here with us this evening for this wonderful gathering titled American Judaism, a History with Dr. Jonathan Sarna. My name is Rabbi Zalman Mendelson, and I serve as the co-director of the Chabad Jewish Center of Wyoming, together with my dear wife, Razy. And it is our mission to share the warmth, beauty, love, wisdom of Judaism with our community and beyond. And it is wonderful to see so many familiar faces, as well as so many faces that are unfamiliar, and it's wonderful to welcome you here this evening. It is, in addition, we are grateful to be co-hosting this event together with our colleagues at the Chabad Center of Jewish Life in Salem, and it is our pleasure to welcome all of our guests who are here with us from the capital of the Beaver State. A few housekeeping items before we get started, our interview with Jonathan Sarna here this evening. First off, Dr. Sarna is a brilliant author who's written many books, and I encourage each and every one of you to visit Amazon.com, find your books, purchase them. You won't regret it. You'll learn something you never thought you would learn before. Second, I'd like to thank Mr. Leon Clark, who's with us here this evening, for making this event possible and all of the time, grace, and effort that he has put into it. Third, I'd like to share with you 3 upcoming events. Please mark your calendars and share with your friends. On May 25th at 7:30 p.m., we will be hosting an event titled Anti-Semitism in America, After Pittsburgh and Poway Is the Party Over, with Professor David Lukens. On May 27th at 7:30 p.m., we'll be hosting an event titled The Cold War, What We Saw, with Bill Whittle. On June 2nd at 7:30 p.m., we'll be hosting an event titled COVID-19 in Teton County and the effects that it's had on our medical community, with Dr. Bruce Hayes. The schedule this evening will begin with a 30-minute interview with Professor Sarna. During the 30-minute interview, please send in your questions to the chat box on this Zoom call. We will get to your questions after the 30-minute interview is over, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible with Professor Sarna. We will likely not be doing live Q&A, so if you have a question, please send it in. As you all know, many in the Jewish community are struggling now during these uncertain times, and many choose to come to Chabad to ask for support during this challenging period. It is my great honor, responsibility, and duty to help support our community with dignity. And so I ask of you, those of you who are on the call connected with the Chabad Jewish Center of Wyoming, and those of you who are on the call connected with the Chabad in Salem, to please visit either jewishwyoming.com/donate or visit jewishsalem.com/donate to make your contribution to the Rabbi's Discretionary Fund so we can support our community during this time. Finally, my wife Razy and I are deeply honored to be joined on this Zoom conference with our very dear and esteemed colleagues, Rabbi Avram and Rabbi Froma Perlstein, the spiritual leaders at the Chabad of Salem. I'd like to call upon Rabbi Perlstein to share his greetings, a short Torah thought, and to introduce our guest who will be conducting this evening's interview. Rabbi Perlstein.
Thank you very much. Good evening. Thank you, Rabbi Zalman, Rebitz and Razy, good friends of ours, and Yasher Koach for the amazing work you guys are doing both in Wyoming and what's helping us here tonight with this event as well. 6 years ago, I gave a JLI course titled To Be a Jew in the Free World. It was fascinating. The course was co-authored by our guest tonight, Professor Jonathan Sarna. In preparation for the course, I read his book, American Judaism, a History, and I've been a fan of his since, but more importantly, American Jewish history has become a very intriguing topic for me. When the previous Chabad Rebbe immigrated to this country after being expelled from communist Russia. He proclaimed about America that America is nicht anders. In English, America is no different. Yes, America stands out as a beacon of freedom and kindness in the world, but it is no different here for the Jew than it was anywhere else in the world. Meaning, we do not, God forbid, take our freedom for granted, and we'll take every advantage of what American life has to offer, but we will pursue success, we'll engage in every aspect of society, but the Jewish mission does not change in this new world, in the free America. We will do it all here, but with the same stiff neck that has allowed us to survive 1,800 years of persecution, guided by the same moral code, the same ethics, and Torah values that have made us the Jewish people. I think this is what fascinates me and many others about Jews as a whole, and particularly American Judaism. Conducting the interview tonight is a local Salemite, a Willamette professor, Professor Ellen Eisenberg. Ellen holds the Dwight and Margaret Lear Chair in American History at Willamette and has published 5 monographs, a number of articles focusing on American Jewish history, and a particular focus in Jews in American West. When I contacted Ellen to conduct tonight's interview, her willingness to do so was exciting and inspirational. Ellen has a wealth of knowledge to share and has that special Jewish knack of graciously sharing that knowledge with others. We have, thank God, been benefactors of that over the years. Every student at Willamette that I meet that has taken her classes proudly tells me that she is one of the best, if not the best professor they have had at Willamette. How apropos it is that Ellen is in the middle of a project to be published by Brandeis University called The Etymology of Jews in Multicultural West. The book she's working on is part of a series published by Brandeis that Professor Jonathan Sarna is the editor for, and her book will appear in that series. It's with my greatest honor to introduce Professor Ellen Eisenberg.
Thank you so much for the introduction and also for this opportunity. I was really thrilled when Rabbi Perlstein contacted me a couple of days ago and invited me to conduct this interview because I too am a great fan of Jonathan Sarna. So let me first introduce him and then we'll begin to talk. Jonathan Sarna is university professor and Joseph H. and Bell R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University, where he directs the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies. He also chairs the academic advisory and editorial board of the Jacob Rader Marcus Center of the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, and serves as the chief historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. Author or editor of more than 30 books on American Jewish history and life, Dr. Sarna's American Judaism, A History was recently published in a 2nd edition and won 6 awards, including the 2004 Everett Jewish Book of the Year Award from the Jewish Book Council, what most of you know as the National Jewish Book Awards. His most recent books are Lincoln and the Jews, A History, When General Grant Expelled the Jews, and Sarna's annotated edition of Cora Wilburn's previously unknown 1860 novel, Casella Wayne, has also just appeared. Dr. Sarna is married to Professor Ruth Langer, and they have 2 married children. It's a great honor to introduce Dr. Jonathan Sarna, the leading historian in my field of American Jewish history, and a great inspiration and mentor to me and to many, many of my colleagues.
Well, thank you so much. A pleasure to be here and really to be here with Professor Eisenberg, whose work I greatly respect and have learned so much from. So, and let me thank Rabbi Mendelson also and Rabbi Perlstein for inviting me, and thank everybody for virtually joining us.
Okay, well, I was hoping to focus our conversation on the ways in which our study of history can help us understand and think through this very unusual current moment that we're living through. So my questions will all revolve around historicizing or thinking historically about the current moment. But before getting to the challenges of the pandemic, I did want to share an observation about the 2 communities involved in this event, Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and Salem, Oregon. Like many, many small Jewish communities in the West, Jackson Hole and Salem are both home to a thriving Chabad center, and also to what I would call a big tent synagogue, Reconstructionist in Salem and unaffiliated, as I understand it, in Jackson Hole. And so I'd be very interested in hearing your thoughts, Jonathan, about the growth in recent decades of both Chabad and of a variety of synagogues that are either unaffiliated or affiliated with a movement other than the big three, then Orthodox, Conservative, or Reform, particularly in communities like these that are small and off the beaten Jewish path, so to speak.
So let's start really with Chabad. Chabad is the greatest Jewish success story of the post-war period. Anyone who would look in 1920 or even 1940 would not find a Chabad house in any American Jewish community. And in 2020, every Jewish community has a Chabad house. That's absolutely extraordinary and not sufficiently appreciated how Chabad really emerged. As Rabbi Pearlstein pointed out, the previous Rebbe said, you know, America is no different. One goes and looks at the context. What he was saying to his followers was, you think America is different and we have to do things differently. But actually, he believed that America was no different in terms of its potential for being a center of Torah. That was a remarkable statement to have made in 1940, but 80 years later, we of course can see the great success of that idea, and Chabad has spread. But I think, Ellen, you're also pointing out that, you know, once upon a time, every Jewish community had often, you know, one synagogue, two synagogues, one would be, or three synagogues. One would be Reform, one Conservative, one Orthodox. In smaller communities, you would have often the temple and the synagogue. Often one was really East European Jews, one German Jews, especially in the South. Today, it's altogether different. And there has been a huge growth in the number of rabbis who really don't come out of any of those big three so-called denominations, but come out of the Hebrew College or some other rabbinical training program, or come out of Chabad, and seek to bring Jews together. What is so fascinating, really, is that Chabad sought to embrace Jews of all kinds, and that was really its success. And many of these other kinds of synagogues like to call themselves trans-denominational, or actually now Jews who call themselves non-denominational, post-denominational, or trans-denominational. You get bonus points if you know the difference between those three terms. That's not a term that Chabad uses at all, but all of those ideas really suggest that the kehillah, the synagogue, is the central organization of Jews, not the denominational bodies. And anyone who has been following has seen that the Reform movement has just announced very significant cuts. The it was revealed that the rabbinical, the OU, the Orthodox Union, cut a lot of people. It's clear that it's the congregation, not so much the denomination, that has been crucial to bring us back to the coronavirus. When the history is properly written, I think we will see that the big heroes across the Jewish community are the rabbis. Different rabbis organize a Seder in a box all over America, or other kinds of needs. The synagogue may be closed, but I don't know any rabbis who were closed. And when the synagogue was closed, rabbis brought us online, and all the rabbis I know across the spectrum are really working very hard. So it's been a reminder that that the essential a Jewish organization is still the synagogue, and the synagogue rabbis are really stepping in during this disaster, this challenge. Much more, I think, than the big organizations. It's been the individual rabbis and individual communities who have stepped up to meet contemporary needs. So.
Yeah, and now that you've started talking about the current situation, I was wondering if we could think about what are the historic parallels that you think about when you look at the crisis facing the entire country, and also what kind of role have Jewish communal and religious institutions played in response to these kinds of broad societal crises? And what can we learn about the community from the way in which this response plays out, both historically and currently?
There's actually, as Professor Eisenberg knows, kind of a new sub-discipline called disaster studies. And there are whole professors now of disaster studies, and they look at the history of disasters over time. I've been interested, so it's always good to build on what one has studied. I've been interested in yellow fever epidemics. Now, admittedly, those tended to be local. In the 19th century, anybody would have known an epidemic. In the 20th century, thank God, we're lucky we haven't experienced them for 100 years. I mean, there have been polio and AIDS and some other things, but we haven't experienced the kind of epidemics that were normative in the 19th century, not only in America, but all over the world. If you go to old prayer books, if you have any, you'll actually find prayers for an epidemic. And if you had those kinds of prayers in a siddur, in a prayer book, that's a sign that they were normative. Now, if you actually look, say, yellow fever, Memphis was a big center of yellow fever in the 1870s. And what one will find, very similar to today, is that Jews, today it's kind of Orthodox Jews in Memphis, they knew that the Israelites, as they called them, had been hit particularly hard by yellow fever. Now, we now understand why that was. Yellow fever did not hit those in Memphis who were African American nearly as hard. because a lot of them were already immune to, we now understand it, it was the mosquito, and they had gotten immunity over time. And a lot of those who lived in Memphis a long time had a kind of natural immunity. But new immigrants were not immune. And that's why, if you go back, you see the Jews suffered disproportionately in the 1870s. Anybody who goes to the Beis Olam, anyone who goes to the cemetery in Memphis will see 1874, 1879, large numbers of, or disproportionate numbers of Jews died because new immigrants didn't have a natural immunity. And now you kind of learn a lot about leadership in disasters. And the interesting thing is, say, Memphis, the rabbi still remembered all these years later that Rabbi Samfield, who was then really the only real rabbi in Memphis, he is remembered as a hero. He must have had natural immunity when you read the stories, but he went from place to place. He worked from morning to night. People remembered that Rabbi Samfield worked to bury, and it didn't matter were they Orthodox Jews, Reformed Jews, he worked to do that. When there isn't leadership, local leaders in Memphis tried to cover up the plague, honestly. And that's common because people know, oh, a plague, that's bad for business. So the first instinct is, let's not tell anyone. Maybe no one will notice. Of course, it's disastrous policy. And very quickly, reality hits. But when leadership, civic leadership tries to do that, what you find is that, okay, people look to leaders at a plague, and they will look to religious leaders who will step in. And in our day, we've seen real heroes in different communities who have stepped in, and so it was in the 1870s. And if you go back further, you see the same thing. People remembered, oh, Gershom Satius. He was remembered in the early post-revolutionary era because in epidemics, he didn't run away. He stayed and met the needs of the community. And so it was in Memphis, and I think in many ways, so it is today. You learn a lot about rabbinic leadership when, crisis hits. There are great rabbis who stay and who are remembered years later, as Samfield was in Memphis, for what they did for the community at time of crisis. You want another example? One of the great Orthodox rabbis was a man named Eliezer Silver. Tremendously significant Orthodox rabbi in the 20th century. But when I lived in Cincinnati, what did people remember? Oh, Rabbi Silver, when we had floods in Cincinnati, people remembered seeing him in a little boat trying to help people. So crisis, disaster, you remember those leaders, whether they are civic leaders or rabbinic leaders or ministerial leaders in the non-Jewish world, who are remembered as heroes. And yes, there are also people who they're remembered. There was, I won't mention the name, but there was a certain rabbi in Savannah. People remembered, oh, he ran away. He was the first to run away. And actually, the minutes of the congregation report that the congregation wrote to him and said, you know what, don't bother coming back. You want to be the first to run away at crisis? Stay there, don't bother. These are moments people in crisis look for a leader. If you're that leader, they will follow you. Just like in, I don't know, in crisis, they followed Moses. If you're the first to run away, that's what they will remember as well. And I think without mentioning contemporaries, we can see which leaders really are emerging in the current crisis. People say, yeah, I look to that person, I follow that politician or that rabbi. And there are other leaders who I think have been tested and have been found wanting. Instead of uniting people and asking them to follow, they divide people. And that's not what people are looking for at this kind of moment of crisis. And that's always the way it's been. Yeah.
Yeah, you when you began to talk about the current situation, you mentioned also the stepping up of leadership that we see across the country among rabbis, and this Zoom conversation, of course, is an example of this, of bringing people together through technology in a moment when we're not able to physically gather together. And many of us, of course, participated in Zoom Passover Seders and so on. People are using Zoom for not only conversations, but for minyanim and for Shabbat services and shivas and so on. And it occurs to me that this is certainly not the first time that Jews have grappled with the place of modern technology in religious life. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of the parallels in the past of communal debates and grappling over the role of modern technology, specifically with regard to religious ritual and some of the consequences of the various decisions made about adopting or not adopting those technologies.
So first of all, many technologies have gotten a boost from crisis. So for example, the Civil War famously gave a tremendous boost to ready-made clothing. Previously, you didn't have ready-made clothing. The Civil War gave a boost to it. The Civil War is long over, but people are still using machine-made clothing and so on. And so I think that I don't usually make predictions. Zoom, which existed before, but has been tremendously boosted in this crisis, and we've all, our presence here is proof of what Zoom can accomplish, and I'm pretty sure that Zoom is going to change our lives long after COVID is over. We'll still be using virtual technologies in new ways that only a few were doing beforehand. Technology has transformed Jewish life, sometimes in controversial ways, sometimes not in controversial ways. Since this is Chabad sponsored, the Rebbe was one of the great pioneers of using new technology. Think of satellites, and he understood that through satellites, he could appear all over the world using this new technology. And he was actually the Lubavitcher Rebbe was a pioneer in how to use new technology to strengthen Judaism. I think he would be pleased to see Rabbi Mendelssohn and Pearlstein using another new technology to strengthen life when we're not supposed to be using our traditional synagogues. Other technologies were more complicated. Electricity, the microphone, they transformed Jewish life, but there were big debates. Can I use it on Shabbat? Can I not use it on Shabbat? The microphone, there were many responses. Can you use it in the synagogue? Can you, or not? Can you read the Megillah through a microphone or not? But leaving aside those questions, these technologies have produced great changes. I mean, take the microphone. Once upon a time, every rabbi was taught how to project voices. I once read parts of the minute book of Temple Emmanuel in New York, the Great Reform Congregation, and various rabbis were judged. Can this rabbi fill the room? And if the rabbi couldn't, he couldn't get hired there. Short rabbis, they always worried. I being short, vertically challenged, I have sympathy for short rabbis, and they couldn't get jobs in many big congregations because the fear was they won't fill the room. Then came along a microphone, totally transformed that. And in fact, it's much harder today even to find people who understand acoustics because people don't realize its great importance. Orthodox synagogues still need acoustical experts, but they're hard to find in a way that they weren't earlier. So every technology has brought about change. Sometimes it's controversial, sometimes less controversial, but when we look historically, we can see its impact. We are now amidst a great digital revolution, not less important in my mind, to my mind, than the earlier revolution of print. And this digital revolution is transforming Jewish life. Those who understand how you can use digital technology to strengthen Jewish life, in a sense, will be the winners. Those who have tried to fight digitization and the computer and cell phone and the like, I think I understand why they're worried by the digital revolution, but there is a sense that they're going to fall by the wayside because you can't really fight technology. What you do better is when you can find ways of harnessing new technology to strengthen Jewish life. The great 19th century rabbis whom we remember, everybody studies two, Isaac Leeser and Isaac Mayer Wise, the two Isaacs. Well, they understood the printing press and the cheap book could strengthen Judaism, and they used those printing presses and harnessed the new technology to really send out books and newspapers to far-flung Jews across the United States. And that technology allowed someone who lived in a frontier community with small numbers of Jews to feel connected to other Jews across the country. If you look at who received the Occident, you realize that technology of the printing press saved American Jewry. And so it is today. Zoom is saving us in this moment.
We have time for another COVID-related question. Yes, Rabbi? Yeah. Okay. So this is a more sobering one. Even before COVID-19, we had been experiencing in this country and more globally a surge of anti-Semitism over the last several years. I wonder what you think about how COVID has or might compound this, given the history of blaming both disease and economic crisis on Jews and also on other ethnic minority groups. And what can we learn from historic examples that might help us to negotiate that crisis?
So, of course, everybody knows that minorities have often suffered at these kinds of times of crisis. The Black Death was frequently blamed on Jews. I have to tell you, the people today who blame Jews, they knew the Jews were responsible even before COVID existed, because it doesn't matter what the problem is, the Jews, to their mind, are always responsible. Now, and there certainly are people, who look, how can, whatever the issue is, economic downturn, they know. They have a conspiratorial view. They always look at Jews. The truth is, what makes America, I think, different from some of the countries that Jews came from is precisely that there are many minorities, there are many outgroups, and we see many groups blame. Lots of Americans, alas, today blame Asians for COVID. And we've seen other groups. And I think it's understandable in the sense that's how can it be people say that out of nowhere a virus comes. We don't see it, and it does such damage. And if you have a conspiratorial mind, you are likely to blame Jews or some minority group that you can feel and touch, rather than believing that it's a virus I can't see. And that's always been true. As I say, it was true in the Black Death and been true many other times. What I think is more productive is to realize that plagues point up the weaknesses of our society. So, for example, cholera or yellow fever that I mentioned before, they demonstrated what happened if you didn't have good sanitation in the community, or in the case of cholera, if you didn't have pure water. Why did Memphis have so much yellow fever? Because it was a community that had totally not invested in infrastructure, and therefore the mosquitoes thrived on standing water and waste, and those mosquitoes spread yellow fever all over. I think that, without getting too specific, after COVID is over, there'll no doubt be an investigation, and we'll see a lot of weaknesses in our own society. and those weaknesses. We felt, oh, we don't have to invest anymore in FEMA or in those government agencies that watch epidemics, and we paid a big price for that neglect. That's what epidemics do. They point to the weak points in society, and each epidemic is different, but I think, you know, that's what is going on. As some people always prefer to blame the other, it's more productive, I think, for us collectively to blame ourselves for not paying attention and to find ways of strengthening our society. But you know, will there be people who look for a scapegoat? Always. It's been true really from the Middle Ages.
Thank you. I'm mindful that there are questions that have been sent in via the chat to the rabbi, so I think I'm going to turn it over to him at this point. But it's been wonderful chatting with you. And
thank you, and I'm honored, and I'll try and answer a little more quickly so we can get to more questions.
This was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Eisenberg, and thank you, Dr. Sarna. So the first question came in asking, it came in from Todd Silverstein, and he's asking what the Rebbe had in mind when he initiated the program to outreach all over the world and set up Chabad houses worldwide. How did that fit in with the trends in the existing Jewish communities there, according to you?
Well, I mean, it would require, first of all, it's worth remembering that this actually began at the previous Rebbe, who sent around the very first shluchim, and actually sent them to my university, at the Brandeis University, and but it was greatly expanded by the Rebbe. Menachem Mendel Schneerson understood that you know, that would be a way of bringing Jews in. You had kind of two strategies. One strategy was, let's build a wall, and another, and many Hasidic communities did build walls so we won't, you know, be polluted by those non-Hasidic Jews or non-observant Jews. And this strategy was the opposite of that. Let's go out and, in a sense, missionize the Jews, bring them back to Judaism. The Rebbe believed there was a spark in every Jew. And it's quite interesting because, you know, Jews had been quite resistant to sending out missionaries saying, no, that's what, you know, that's what Christians do. But this was a different kind of missionary movement, a movement to missionize the Jews, convert them and bring them back. And in a way, because the Rebbe believed that there was this vast potential in America, others argued America was a Taifan Medina, an unkosher land. He looked at it and saw vast potential, and he was prepared to you know, send each year more emissaries, and these emissaries imagined that that would be a way both of bringing the Messiah and of strengthening Jewish life. And it was a very successful strategy, as anyone who goes to any community can see. And when you look at it historically, it's particularly particularly easy to see. More could be said on, but let's take other questions. Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is from Ellie Herb. He writes, early on in the COVID-19 story, synagogues across the country were closing their doors, even before executive orders, guidelines from the CDC and the WHO. It's been remarkable to me how much of the Jewish world has responded to this crisis with a lot of foresight. To what do you attribute that?
Well, I think you will find that many rabbis across the spectrum said, when it comes to a medical matter, we rely on medical experts. And many synagogues have medical experts as members. And the rabbis, learning from what generations of rabbis had taught them, said, we've got to listen in this matter to science, to the doctors. And the doctors told them, the sooner you close down, the better. They explained to them how an epidemic works. And the rabbis listened, just like we're taught that a rabbi can't tell you whether you should fast if you're sick. You go to the doctor, even a non-Jewish doctor. And so it was here. We listened to medicine. And I think those who believed science and who listened to epidemiologists and listened to their doctors were much better off than those who thought they knew better than the doctors, knew better than the epidemiologists. You know, I'll open up, and then we've seen horrific things where in one case a church opened and a huge percentage came down with the virus. So, you know, in a sense, I would have to say in my own community, there were doctors who saw what was going on in Boston. They were in close touch. They warned people in advance, and they told the rabbi, you know, cancel Purim Suda. Don't have a big meal on Purim. That's very dangerous, and that probably saved a lot of us from getting a coronavirus in the Boston area.
Excellent, thank you. Firstly, if anybody has questions that they want to send in anonymously, feel free to just send it in privately. This next question has come in anonymously. Question is, isn't the story of American Judaism quite remarkable relative to the history of Jewish life prior? Why do you think Judaism has thrived in America?
I wrote a whole book on that. It's hard to, but it's a very good question. Look, first of all, Judaism, we should pay close attention to the Constitution and not underestimate its significance. The fact that you said in the original Constitution, no religious test shall ever be required for any office or public trust under the United States. It was amazing. It was nowhere in the world in the late 18th century that basically said no religious test is required. Most countries thought, well, we need a religious test. How will we know who we can trust? If someone isn't a good Christian, I don't want them in leadership. But America said no religious test is required. And the assumption was, well, we judge people by their merits. Of course, it was very fortunate that America was made up of many, many denominations and groups, not just one. And Jews, of course, were never the only out group in America. I mean, of course, you had African Americans, you had Catholics, and we should never forget there were Catholic churches that were burned down and attacked, and a whole political party that was anti-Catholic. So Jews, America has had many, many out groups. Many groups in America remembered when they were out, and that has benefited Jews in a way that they didn't benefit in countries where they were the only out group. So there were both sociological factors, many, many groups, Jews not the only out group, and also the impact of the Constitution, which you can really see moving forward, that made things possible for Jews, opened up opportunities that Jews were able to take advantage of. And of course, there was a big country, and Jews were able to move freely and follow opportunities. And that too is an enormously important thing. We often forget in many parts of Europe, Jews were not free to move. In America, they were. And there are any number of cases where you can see that a place mistreated Jews, and they upped and left and moved somewhere else where there were more opportunities. So I hope that gives at least some food for thought of what the reason is for Jewish success. Yeah. Other questions?
Yes, thank you. Eric asked, if you had an opportunity to go back and live in any era of Jewish history, when would you choose to live and why?
Wow, what era would I choose to live and why? Honestly, I'm rather glad when I look at a lot of eras of Jewish history. We don't think about it, but I think we're very fortunate to live in the era of Jewish history that we live. I mean, compare our lives to that of of so many of our grandparents or great-grandparents who had to either escape from persecution, and if it wasn't escaping persecution, and we know not everybody left because of pogroms, but there was no opportunity for Jews in the largest population center of Jews in Russia. And America offered them opportunity, and that's why they came. But, you know, they started and suffered, and it was their children who made it, and then the next generation even more. I'm not saying we are without problems, but we are so incredibly fortunate. Most American Jews are middle class. American Jews, I think, have the leisure time to listen to programs like this one, and we have the ability, and even technologically, it's never been easier to learn, to study. If one goes back to 100 years or 150 years in America, in the middle of the 19th century, it was almost impossible to get a set of the Talmud in America. We have all sorts of people. A scholar named Max Margolis wanted to study the Talmud. He couldn't find a set of Talmud in America really to work on. So in many ways, we are at an incredibly fortunate moment, both economically and in terms of the democratization of Jewish learning. There are lots of people I would be happy to meet. Who wouldn't have wanted to meet Moses Maimonides? Unbelievable what one man was able to produce in so many eras. But I wouldn't have wanted to have had the life that Moses Maimonides did, to have to escape. His father and he escaped for their because of persecutions in Spain and so on. I wouldn't have wanted the life he had, but I would have loved to have met him. We should not underestimate how fortunate we are to live when we do with a state of Israel and with the vast majority of Jews living without the kind of persecution that Jews once had. The vast majority of Jews live either in the state of Israel or in North America today, and and most Jews are in first world countries. So we shouldn't underestimate Ashreinu Matov Chelkenu, how fortunate we are to live as we do.
I agree. That was beautifully said. Thank you. We'll finish off with the last two questions. This question is from Lewis, who says, over the last few months, there seems to have been an increase in discussions between Jewish and non-Jewish leaders regarding how to respond to this crisis. Given that synagogues and other religious institutions may permanently change as a result of COVID-19, do you see the possibility of a growth in interfaith dialogue? And could this aid the Jewish community as it faces an increase in anti-Semitism?
It's interesting. I think that the COVID has reminded us of what we all have in common as human beings and in terms of threats we face. And as I say, I think we will look back at synagogues and churches as some of the most successful organizations in terms of really meeting people's needs on the ground. And I think those who are paying attention see, I mean, the African-American community is being decimated. Honestly, the Haredi community in the United States, it's being totally disproportionately hit, and those groups that have been hit understand what it means in that way, and will see things in common. So I'd like to believe it's a nice idea. There is a kind of regression, and I would remind you that in 1920, Harding won on a slogan of return to normalcy. In other words, there'd been World War I, and there'd been a much more devastating epidemic of flu in 1918. And then he wanted to return people to the way things had been before. And I think we're going to have a lot of people when this is over who will want to return to normalcy. But I hope that we can remind people, this the flu doesn't ask, are you Jewish or Christian? And often we too should be willing to help anybody in need. So that I think is what the question is about. There was another question that you said.
Yes, so we have one
Yes.
last question. Jennifer asked, having studied Jewish history, what do you think is the likelihood of such terrible things as pogroms or persecution other generations suffered from happening here in the US?
So we don't have a lot of time. Let me say, on the one hand, as the questioner understood, a lot of Jewish communities thought they were safe until they weren't. And Jewish history reminds us that we should be vigilant, and we should be. On the other hand, American Jews have imagined, even in their own time, that there'll be pogroms and that there'll be all sorts of attacks that never happened. Wow, a Jew gave atomic secrets to the enemy. The Rosenberg case I'm referring to in the 50s. And many Jews thought there would be pogroms, but there weren't. Or Jonathan Pollard, many people said, oh, there'll be pogroms, but there weren't. Or Madoff. My phone rang off the hook from people saying, should we leave America after so much money was lost because of Mr. Madoff? Won't there be pogroms? Shouldn't we get out in time? But there weren't any pogroms. So the answer, I think, and maybe this is a good note on which to end, on Mondays and Wednesdays and Fridays, I'm quite a nervous guy. It's good to be a bit nervous as a Jew. And on Sunday and Tuesday and Thursday, I'm optimistic. We're fortunate to live where we are. There haven't been pogroms. And then you spend Shabbat trying to figure out how do we move from the fearfulness to the optimism. But it's good to keep both in mind. So on that note, I hope we too can move to an optimistic future from the quite frightening period that we are in now. Again, want to thank Professor Eisenberg and want to thank the two Chabad houses that are here are 16 hours drive from one another, but are all united by cyberspace, a wonderful idea. I want to thank you for sponsoring this and thank everybody for taking time to be with us. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely, and again, I want to thank you, Professor Sarna and Professor Ellen Eisenberg, for your time and your expertise. It was absolutely beautiful. One thing that we find consistent throughout Torah literature and Hasidic literature is that Jewish topics and Judaism, Torah, is an incredible uniting factor. And the unity that is created over Zoom and discussions of this nature is absolutely beautiful. Just like the virus doesn't ask questions about who we are, we as Jews shouldn't be asking questions who we each other are, and continue to unite in a beautiful fashion. So again, a big thank you. Thank you so much to all those that have joined. Thank you, the Mendelssohns from Wyoming, and all of those from Salem and Wyoming who joined together in tonight's evening. Yasher koach. Everyone continue to stay safe.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.